Recording started.
All right, so once again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Analyze a Budget and Make Mid-Project Changes. This webinar is being presented by the Pacific Region Training and Technical Assistance Center, a resource of the Administration for Native Americans. My name is Matthew Ng. I am the Outreach and Technology Specialist for today's session, for the Pacific TTA Center, excuse me. Leading today's session will be Susan White, our Technical Assistant Specialist. She'll be coming on a little later, and we're happy to be able to feature OGM Grants Management Officer Tim Chappelle. So a little about ANA, the Administration for Native Americans. ANA promotes self-sufficiency for Native Americans by providing discretionary grant funding for community-based projects and training and technical assistance to eligible tribes and Native organizations. ANA's vision is that all Native communities are thriving, and so that's really what their long-term vision is. They won't rest until that has happened, and this webinar is a part of their mission in reaching that vision. And so hopefully you can take some of the resources that you learn during today's webinar and bring them back to the communities that you serve. Now, before we start today's webinar, I just want to kind of make you aware of some of the upcoming webinars that we have. And so ANA, for the most part, holds a national webinar every Thursday. So today's webinar is on budgets and making mid-project changes. On May 22nd, next week, we will have a webinar on how urban communities can implement native language classes. So if you're doing some type of language project, or if you work with language organizations, that might be something you'd want to check out. On June 5th, the Pacific region will be hosting a webinar on social media and different strategies for implementing social media in your project. And then the week after that, we'll have a webinar on Two-Spirit LGBT projects in Native communities. And you can find and register for all of ANA's webinars by visiting the events page on the ANA website. Now, a couple other ANA announcements before we get underway. So just to let you all know, currently panel review, the objective panel review process is underway for 2014. So all of the grant applications that were submitted before the April 15th deadline are in the process of being reviewed. And so that's happening now, just to let you know. Also, the Native Assets Building Initiative grant funding announcement, opportunity announcement is available now, and you can find that in the grants section of the ANA website. And just a reminder for all existing grantees, I know because of the mid-project changes part of this webinar, we do have several existing ANA grantees with us today. Just a reminder that your grantee meeting will be happening very soon, the week of June 16th. And that's something that's required on an annual basis for ANA grantees. But what you learn during this webinar will be applicable to not just grantees, but also anyone working with Native communities and actually anyone working with a budget. And so at this point, I'd like to pass it off to today's main presenter, Susan White. Susan White is our Technical Assistant Specialist, but she's also really a master of project financials and looking at budgets. She's a budget guru. So Susan, please take it away.
Okay, excuse me. Thank you, Matt. Basically, what we hope to do in today's webinar is we want to provide you with kind of foundational knowledge. What are the rules around budget modifications? If you have federal funds, what are the federal rules? All right, so that'll be the first part. And then the second part, we're just going to talk about how do you look at your budgets? How do you analyze them? And then how do you modify them? What are the steps we need to go through to modify them? So that's the two goals of this webinar. And Matt, I don't know how to change slide. Oh, never mind, I got it. Okay. So let's talk about your budget for a minute. First of all, your project activities and your project budget, they're dependent upon each other. You know, they go hand in hand. Sometimes they don't hold hands real well, all right? But they need to. So, and it's all part of the whole when we look at it. It's all part of the project, okay? And when you have a puzzle, you need to put the pieces together. And that's what you need to do. The financial and the budget need to work together. Everything has to come together. Because as you know, when you're managing projects, things change, okay? Everything doesn't go exactly as planned, has been my experience over the years, you know. And so just as you might change not change your activities, but modify your activities, maybe your participants have additional needs that you hadn't anticipated, or you have a new partner that's bringing some resources to the project, your budget needs to move with the project. So that's why the two have to go together. Unfortunately, sometimes we have a real static budget and it's not moving with the project. So they really, really are one, or they should be as one. So today we are so fortunate, you guys. Tim Chappelle is going to be presenting about the federal rules, all right? And Tim is the grants officer for ACF. He's been there for a while, okay? But in addition to working with A&A projects, A&A grants, and he's the man, you guys, all right? So anyway, he's the one that has to sign on that. He also is responsible for the Office of Child Care Grants, the Office of Family Assistance Grants, the Office of Planning, Research, and Education Grants, okay? And then who you usually interact with are the program or the grants management specialists. Well, they all work with Tim, under Tim, you know. So I just want to say, I just think we're very, very privileged to have Tim on the call today because honestly, he is the busiest man I know. He's got probably thousands of grants out there, and we're still struggling with our 5 or 10 grants and that, or maybe one. So Tim is going to be talking to us about the federal rules. And I'm going to turn it over to Tim in a few minutes, but first, because Tim is busy, he's going to do his presentation, and then we're going to have a question and answer just for Tim, all right? You know how we usually hold it till the end? Well, we're going to have one when, when Tim is done with his presentation. A couple of other things, when we're talking about a budget change, we're talking about moving the funds from one line item to another line item. We're not going to be talking about planning a budget at all today. We're just going to be talking about budget changes once you have an approved federal budget. Okay? And then there's really two types of changes. There's the external change, and that's what Tim's going to be talking about. That's the kind of change when you go into the Administration for Native Americans or whoever your funder is for a budget modification. Tim will be telling us that, and then we're going to talk about the internal changes when I come back on. But I think it's real important to listen to what Tim has to say because, again, you know, just like anything you do, there's rules. And the same holds true for grants management. There's rules. You wouldn't go and play basketball without knowing the rules. Well, that's true with grants management. And Tim really is, you know, the final say on those rules. So you need to know the rules before we can even talk about what kinds of changes we can make because we need to have those rules in order to determine how we make those changes. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tim.
Thanks, Susan. And hello, everyone. I'm glad to be a part of the webinar today. I confess that I'm unable to log in. I tried to, but it wouldn't let me. So I have printed out the slides, Susan, so I will be starting from the slide, what is a budget, and move from there. But just grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you grantees about budget modifications and what constitutes prior approval and what does not, and the things that you can implement under your own authority and the things that you need grantor agency approval before implementation. So hello again. I don't like to say that I'm the final say about things. We do have a process here. We've got policies and procedures and regulations and authorizing legislation that kind of guide us and navigate us through what's permissible and what's not permissible and that kind of thing. And then here internally, I work with closely with the program managers, ANAs, program directors, and commissioners to make decisions about what can be done and what can't be done. And then if there's still further confusion or ambiguous decisions to be made, then we can consult with the Division of Grants Policy here in ACF. And if necessary, we can go to the Office of General Counsel at the department and seek further guidance. So it's a whole array of things that we use to make decisions to come up with a final decision regarding any aspect of grants management. But what is a budget change? And it's really what Susan said, and it's basically any deviation from what was approved in the application and is represented on the notice of award. That is the legal and binding contract. So any deviations from that would be a change, constitute a change. And as Susan said, there are two types of budgetary changes. One requires approval from the grantor agency, and one does not. Budget modifications that require external approval of the grantor agency must be submitted in writing and may not be implemented until the grantee receives written approval from the grantor agency. And that written approval is usually in the form of an amended notice of award. And the budget categories will reflect the change, and in the remarks of the notice of award will give the basis for making this change. Grantees are reminded to submit your budget request early as possible because there's a process that we follow internally where the request is first reviewed by the ANA program office, and then they provide their recommendation, and then it comes to the Office of Grants Management, and we look at the recommendation, we look at the request, and then we see if we can support it or not. Once all hearts and minds are clear on it and agree on it, then we will issue an amended award giving approval. If we disapprove your request, then we will follow up with an official letter to you explaining why we disapproved your request. Budget modifications that may be approved internally by the grantee organization, of course, do not require prior approval of the grantor agency and may be implemented at any time during your budget period. However, grantees must ensure that these types of post-award changes do not result in the need for additional dollars. So the onus is on you to ensure that whatever change you're making under your authority does not result in a deficit in your budget that will necessitate us having to award additional dollars. For changes made under the grantee's authority, we do ask that you keep us in the loop so that we ensure that your official grant file accurately reflects the project currently being implemented. In addition, this also ensures that, one, whatever is being implemented is really within your authority. Two, it won't show up on some subsequent audit report as a finding. And 3, we are able to expedite any future requests for carryover of unobligated funds from a past budget period. Now, I'm going to give you an example of one of these. We had a grantee from the Administration for Developmental Disabilities that proposed to modify their conference room and intended to charge 100% of the modification effort, which totaled $55,000 to ACF, to our grant. Although the grantee didn't need our approval, our prior approval to implement that, the grantee submitted a copy of the budget modification as an FYI to be included in the official grant file. We discovered by reading the modification, at the time the conference room was being shared with other non-ACF programs, and consequently those other programs had to bear their share of the cost to modify the conference room. So the grantee went back and they devised an allocation based on the percent of time each program used the conference room. And then they charged each program proportionately. And so the initial charge to ACF was $55,000, but after they reallocated the modification to other programs, the cost to ACF's grant was only $20,000. So therefore we were able to take the other $25,000 and reinvest it back into the project. So this potentially could have showed up on an audit report because they qualified for the annual audit as a finding. And we would have had to support the finding. They would have had to remit the funds back to ACF. So it's not that we want you to give us, we're not trying to approve the things that you can implement on your own. We just want to make sure that there are things that you can implement and that you don't get in trouble later on down the road for doing that. Okay, the next slide, external approval. These are some of the types of post-award changes that require grantor agencies' approval prior to implementation. Now, I'm going to read these, but I will expound on a few of them. But they are all cited in the grants policy statement. And I hope you guys are familiar with the grants policy statement. Many years ago, HHS did not have a policy manual that was available to grantees. We had internal manuals that we read and told us how to proceed and how to do things, but the grantee was not privy to that. And so it left you guys out of the loop. And so years later, somebody came up with the bright idea, why don't we make something available to the grantee so they can know what we know and be able to act accordingly. And hence the grants policy statement was implemented. So you can find this, if you don't have it already, on the HHS website. The first thing here is change of scope. Change in scope resulting from significant rebudgeting, transfer of substantive programmatic work to a third party, purchase of a unit of general or special purpose equipment, to name a few, may result in a change of scope. And it's stated in the grants policy statement that significant rebudgeting occurs when cumulative transfers among direct cost budget categories for the current budget period exceed 25% of the total approved budget. Now, some items within that 25% may require prior approval, but it's less than 25%, but it still requires prior approval. So, for instance, if you're purchasing, you want to purchase equipment, and it doesn't exceed 25%, but yet equipment is a prior approval item. So in that case, you would have to request prior approval for the purchase of equipment. But if it doesn't require prior approval and it's less than 25% of the total direct cost, then you may make the budget change. Change in status of key personnel. Now this results in a continuous absence of 3 months or more, or a reduction of time by 25% or more from the allocation approved in the application of the PIPD or other key individuals who contribute to the programmatic aspects of the project in a substantive, measurable way, regardless of whether they are compensated through grant funds or not. The cost principles, prior approval requirements. Now, the cost principles are the OMB circulars. A122 is for nonprofits, and A21 is for educational institutions. A87 is for state, local, and Indian tribal governments. And so these, they have items of cost, and they, tell you if these items of cost are allowable, and that kind of thing. What the cost principles tells us is that we have to look at these items of cost to determine if, one, if they are allowable, two, if they're reasonable, three, if they are necessary, and four, if they are applicable to the project. So an item of cost may be allowable, but then the other litmus test is it reasonable? Is it necessary? So we look at those other things as well. But cost principles will give you a basic guide as to what items of cost are allowable to a particular grant. They can be superseded by the authorizing legislation, which may, may contradict the cost principle. So in order of precedence, the authorizing legislation takes precedent over everything. Okay, transfer of amounts for training allowances or other budget categories. And when we approve funds for training, generally those funds cannot be rebudgeted without prior grantor agency approval. Okay, the next slide talks about alterations and renovations. Now, that usually this is addressed in the funding opportunity announcement, and for A&A, for the most part, the alterations or renovations have to be incidental and minor, and it has to be under a certain dollar amount. I think it's like $150,000, which I think it's whichever is less, $150,000 or 25% of the total project cost, which includes non-federal share. So, but it cannot be construction, and it cannot be, and anything above that would be considered major renovation. So it really has to be incidental. So, for instance, if you need an office space, and the building that you want to lease for the project needs electrical systems are not up to code, or the plumbing is not up to code, or you may want to move an interior wall or something like that, a non-weight bearing wall. Those things would be incidental and necessary. So you could do that. But if you wanted to construct something, that would be unallowable. If you wanted to move a weight bearing wall, that would be unallowable, and things of that nature. But you can always refer back to the funding opportunity announcement. And that's one of the things that we do here too. When there's questions about certain things, the first rule of thumb we do is just go back to the announcement and say, well, what did we intend? What did the announcement say? What was the intention of this? Did it put limitations on there? And that kind of thing. And then we kind of flow from that to the other documents and policies. Carryover of unobligated balances. And this is a biggie. First, let me just say, that carryovers are not, an entitlement grant or anything like that. They're solely at the discretion of the awarding agency. The awarding agency may choose to allow carryovers, or they may choose to use unobligated balances to offset future awards, or they may put it back into play to make additional funding decisions. So, but the thing about carryover is that if the unobligated balance is indicative of unmet goals and objectives or activities approved for the budget period in which the funds were awarded, grantees may request a carryover and the associated unobligated balance into the current budget year so that those activities and goals can be completed. But grantees must ensure that they have submitted a final budget period SF425 report that shows the unobligated balance. And grantees must ensure that funds remain in their payment account in the payment management system. That's the first thing we do is we look at the final 425 to see if it's there, and we go to the payment management system to see if the funds are there and that both pieces of information match. If they don't match, then that just halts the whole review process. Grantees should submit their carryover request as soon as possible in the current budget period. Now we know we asked for a final budget period report 90 days from the end of the budget period. And a lot of times grantee will submit the second semi-annual report and mark it final because they pretty much know their expenditures have been paid and everything is complete, and they'll submit it at that time. But the general rule is to submit your carryover request as soon as possible in the budget period. If you wait till later on in the budget period to submit it, then the other thing we're going to look at is it really reasonable to expect the grantee to implement unmet goals and objectives akin to $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 with 1 month remaining in the budget period. So then that's another thing we have to consider. No cost extensions. We have the authority to approve no cost extensions up to 12 months. On some occasions, especially this happens in the research grant world, where the data collection has not been completed, in the 12-month extended period for whatever reasons, and so an additional period of time may be needed. And so if that pans out, then what we have to do is submit a deviation request to the Chief Grants Officer for approval. So that's a special request that's prepared by ANA and myself and submitted to the Chief Grants Officer. So that is an option, but it mostly happens during those research grants. Requests for no-cost extension should be submitted at least 30 days before the end of the budget period. And like I say, ANA reviews the grantee request first, then it comes to OGM. ANA has a much larger staff than I and contractors. I have 8 staff, and they average about 90 grants, per person. So it's a big responsibility. So it takes some time to get these requests reviewed and approved in a timely fashion. So the earlier you can submit that request, the better. Need for additional funding, we talked about that. Transfer of substantive programmatic work, we talked about that. The next slide, change of grantee organization. This is very rarely requested, but I have processed a few of them. And generally this occurs when, under a research grant, if the grant was awarded based on the experience of the PIPD, the researcher, and the University of Iowa, it houses the PIPD, the researcher. So then the award is made to the University of Iowa. But then if the PIPD then transfers over to the University of Illinois, and the award was made based on that researcher, then that grant can also transfer, provided that Iowa submits a relinquishment letter and the University of Illinois submits a full application to accept the award and provide assurances that the project will continue to be implemented as originally approved. You know, another instance of a grant transfer is if an organization, you know, is dissolved, and you know, they want to transfer it to another organization that, you know, may be down the street or may be in the same vicinity that does the same or similar kind of work that they do. And so in that case, we would ask the receiving organization to submit a full application and provide assurances that the project will continue to be implemented and hopefully be able to retain most, if not all, of the employees from the former organization. Deviations from award terms and conditions. That one is, we don't do much of that. That would have to be kind of on a case-by-case basis. The award terms and conditions really are what they are. They may change, provided, you know, if the awarding agency has to implement enforcement action. So, but for a grantee to request a change in the terms and conditions, I haven't had very many of those. So we would review that on a case-by-case basis. And I guess one of the things would be if a grantee wanted to change the reporting frequency, you know, from, you know, semi-annual to quarterly or something like that, or so we could entertain those kinds of things. But again, we would go back to the funding opportunity announcement to see what it had to say on it, and if other grantees are subject to that, then we would expect you to be too. Foreign component added to a grant. Pre-award cost. Now, I know none of my programs, but I do have there are a few other programs in ACF that are managed by other GMOs, but none of my program allow for pre-award costs. And if there are some in ACF that do allow that, then it would be stipulated in the funding opportunity announcement and the terms. And it would also be stipulated in any competing continuation instruction that may come about. Indemnification of third parties. We don't authorize that. The next slide talks about really the costs that require proper. These are the OMB circulars, the cost principles, and and you can refer to them, and they'll tell you exactly what these things are, whether they're allowable or not. Now, like pre-award costs here, the circular may say that that's an allowable cost, but ACF has determined that that will not be an allowable cost for their programs. So in this instance, the HHS regulation has precedence over the OMB circular. I did look at advisory councils in the circular, and it's the same definition for both the government circular and the nonprofit organization. It says costs incurred by an advisory council or committees are allowable as a direct cost where authorized by the federal awarding agency, or as an indirect cost where applicable to federal awards. So that would be an allowable cost, and it's provided that you're not double dipping, you're not charging it directly, and you're also recouping the cost in indirect. So it's either one or the other if you're going to charge those costs. But then again, we would look at it and see if the costs are reasonable, if they're necessary in that context there. So I think that's all I want to say about this, and I'm open to any questions that you may have. Also, before I do that, let me just say this. I'm sure all of you all are familiar with the Grant Solutions grant emails, grant e-system that we have. And in Grant Solutions, for every type of post-award action, there are instructions as to what constitutes an application of that type. So if you wanted to do a carryover of an unobligated balance, then there's a set of instructions as to what you should submit with your application to request a carryover. And I think that's it. Any questions?
At this time, we'll be taking questions for Mr. Chappelle. I have the instructions for how to ask a question on the screen there. There are two options. You could either type your question into the chat box, or you can press the talk button in the audio and video box on your webinar screen to submit your question. Just before you do that, click on the little sign that looks like a raised hand in order to secure your position in the question queue. So we have one question from Kristen, and she asks, the 25% allowable to move funding, is that within categories or between categories?
That is cumulative across all categories.
All right, thank you, Tim.
Mm-hmm. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, does that answer your question, Kristen? Yeah, she says yes.
Okay.
Thank you. We have one more question from Angela, and Angela asks, can we move between personnel and other direct costs? Can move between personnel and other direct costs without prior approval?
Yes, as long as it's not key personnel. If it's key personnel, then we want to know if we want to know how does that impact the project. So we want to know that.
All right, does that answer your question, Angela? Yep, she says yes.
Okay.
All right, we have one more question from Gila. Gila asks, the no-cost extension would create changes in the OWP. Is this a correct understanding, and do we need a different process to change OWP?
The OWP is a tool that ANA uses. It would certainly change to reflect the activities to be performed and completed in the extended period. So I'm not sure if ANA would want you to amend the current OWP or submit a new one, but in the no-cost extension request instruction in Grant Solution, it will ask you to submit a timeline as to how you think that you will complete each activity and when. So then that would be in addition to the OWP. But from a grants management perspective, we look at the timeline to see when you propose to complete these things.
Thanks for that clarification, Tim. And Gila, if you still have questions about that, you could actually address that to Susan later in the webinar. She'll be elaborating a little more, and there will be another chance to ask questions more related to that kind of stuff. We have one more question from Tammy, and I think this is going to have to be the last question for Tim today. So Tammy's question is, If making simple additions to the budget to help achieve the goal, do we need prior approval to add necessary purchases that are not listed in the budget, such as supplies, travel, and other items?
No, you don't. That's within your authority to implement. Like I said earlier, the only thing that we would like to be able to do is to be able to ensure that the grant that you're implementing is currently reflected in our grant system. So if you're going to buy, if you're changing categories, you're doing a budget mod to put more monies in supplies and something else, if you could just send us an email saying that, I've changed the following categories, we will put that in the official grant file and it will be noted. And the other reason why we ask you to just give us a heads up about those things or put us in the loop about the things that you can and have implemented is to not only ensure that the grant that we have in our system, the official grant file, accurately mirrors the current project you're implementing, but if you were to come in later for a carryover of unobligated balance of funds, the first thing we do is to see what unmet goals, objectives, and that kind of thing that were approved in the past year were not met. And so if you've implemented some, budget changes under your own authority, and we don't have, notation of that in the official grant file, then that stops the review and approval of your carryover because we don't have a match. We have a mismatch. And so you may, what's a good example of something like that? Let's say you moved money in support of, you increased the hours of an employee to handle some unexpected workload that came in or something. So the employee went from 0.5 to 0.75. And you can implement that. It's not a key employee and that kind of thing. But now the work didn't get finished. It needs to be carried over, and the additional time needs to be carried over to support the work. But we don't have, we can't validate it from the information we have in the grant system. So then we're going to say, well, no, we can't approve that because we allocated 50%. 50% was spent, and so we can't support that. And there's no reference to additional work being done. And so if we had that information with us, then it would expedite the review and approval of your carryover request.
Yeah, thanks for that great answer, Tim. So that was the last question for this Q&A session for you. I'd just like to, on behalf of the ANA and the Pacific TTA Center, thank you again for making time for us in today's webinar. Your expertise is totally the highlight of today's session, so thank you once again.
Okay, I'm going to hang on for a little while.
All right, thanks. So at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Susan to bring us to the end of this webinar. At the end, we'll have another opportunity for questions. We might go slightly over time, so if you need to leave the webinar at 4 Eastern, then feel free. We are recording this and we'll be posting it later. So Susan, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. And I too want to thank you, Tim, for that. So what Tim has gone over is these are the rules and these why they're, and he provided us with good information why they're in place and what they're used for from a funder's position. All right? So now the next set of rules that you have to look at before you decide about a modification is what are your own internal requirements. Every tribe has, certain requirements, every organization, all the colleges do, so you're going to have to comply with those. And those are all different, so we're not going to go into that, but that you have to be conscious of too. And if you don't know what those are, then you really need to talk to your accounting office or administration to find out what those are. All right? So just remember, those all come into play. Again, first I really want to emphasize this, what the budget is. And the budget is the financial plan for your project. Okay? And it's been approved by your funder. irregardless of who that funder is. If it's tribal funds, the tribal council probably approved it. You know, if it's federal funds, the federal agency has approved it. If it's state funds, the state has approved it. So again, it really is just, it's part of the total project, and the budget and the finance and project have to work hand in hand. Okay, so now we're going to get into the analysis part of it. You know, how do I analyze my expenditures? All right. What do I look for when I'm deciding, you know, if I need a modification or not? Well, we're going to divide the expenditures into two different categories. One are called your fixed costs, and you're going to have those costs. Regardless, those things will keep happening. People get paid, okay? You have to pay the office rent on your office space. There's certain things that are fixed costs that are going to happen. And then there's other things that are variable costs. And those are going to change in proportion to the level of activities that you're doing within your project. So we have to be conscious that we have both fixed costs and variable costs, and we need to analyze the two when we're looking at should we do a modification to our budget. Okay? So let's take a look at this budget. Well, now, if you have personnel, those are pretty fixed costs. You know, you may have some people that are part-time that work 20 hours one pay period and 30 another, but typically the personnel costs are fixed, and those don't really change too much. All right? But what happens here is we're looking at this when you're thinking about the money and moving the money around and what to do with it. Say that you plan on hiring a teacher or someone in month 2 for your language project, but you actually aren't able to hire them because for whatever reason until month 3. Well, you know almost immediately that you're going to have excess funds in your personnel costs. It's a fixed cost. You can plan it out throughout the end of the year. Or if you have a vacancy for 2 months, you know there's going to be some unspent funds in the personnel costs, so you'll know those right on. Those are pretty easy ones to watch and monitor, all right? And then the fringe benefits costs, they'll follow the personnel costs. So they'll probably be in proportion to whatever changes are happening in personnel. So I call that a fixed cost, all right? With travel, basically when I'm talking about travel right here, I'm talking about out-of-area travel. You know, in your budgets you put what trips you are going to take, you know, the purpose of those trips, and what your, you know, projected costs for those trips are. Well, you go to Post Award, and you may have $2,500 in your budget for that, and it only costs $2,100. You know as soon as you file your travel expense report, which hopefully is the first day after you get home, that you've got $400 there that you may need, you know, that you have, that if something comes up, it is available if you need it to do the scope of work of the project to move somewhere. So that's a fixed cost. Equipment is easily a fixed cost because you say you're going to buy a copier, but you plan on spending $7,000 for the copier, it costs $6,000. The minute you buy that copier, you know you've got $1,000. So you're watching those kinds of things all the time, but you know immediately whether there might be funds available for movement if you need it, all right? Supplies, now supplies is a real variable cost because really the supplies, you know, based on your level of activity. If they're training supplies, it depends on how many participants, you know, are in the project and things like that. If you have, say you plan for 50 and you let 100 people and there's 100 people, huge interest in the community for it, you're going to need a lot more supplies, so you're going to have to be looking at that quite closely, and that is totally going to be tied into the activities and participation of the project. Contractual, we're going to call that a fixed cost because usually with a contract there's a scope of work, there's a set dollar amount, and you know what's going to happen with that pretty easily. I mean, you know, there's nothing set in stone. I mean, we could argue on some of the, not argue, but we could discuss the exceptions on these, you know, but I'm talking about kind of general rules of thumb. Okay, now we get into our other direct costs, and this is where we very often see the variable cost. Postage, again, level of activity. Say that you have a component in your project for participant stipends, totally contingent upon participation in your project. Printing, depending on what it's for, there's probably a variable cost. It's going to depend on activity. Telephone and office rents are fixed. You pay it, you know, you got the office for a month. Okay, local mileage, that's usually a real variable cost. Okay, this is one that I know that happens in a lot of projects where they didn't anticipate that, you know, 70% of the participants are going to need transportation, so the staff are out there bringing them in their personal autos and things like that. So that's one you have to watch real closely. Then indirect, I say it's a fixed cost, but of course we all know that it's based on, I need to qualify that, it's actually based on the actual expenditures, all right? So that's the first thing you have to do is take a look. What are my fixed costs and what are my variable costs? All right, and the variable ones are the ones that you really have to pay attention to. The fixed ones, the minute something happens that's not quite as planned, you should be able to project what's happening within that line item. Okay, the other thing you're going to have to know is what type of accounting assistant do you have? Are you on a cash basis? And if so, that means you recognize the expense at the time the check is written. Are you on a modified accrual? That means that you recognize the expense and you'll see it in your reports at the time, depending upon what it is. Some costs are put in at the time that the cost is incurred. Other smaller ones usually are put in at the time the check's written. And then the third type is an accrual basis where you know exactly where you stand at all times when you get to your reports because you recognize the cost at the time that it's incurred, not when it's paid. So again, that all plays into it as well. So know what type of accounting system you're on, and your finance department can help you with this for project people, all right? Okay, now let's take a budget. This is your typical budget, all right? You usually get that you get every month, your budget report that you get that tells what your budget is, what your current expenditures are, your cumulative, and how much you have left. So that's what we all see. Well, how do we really look at this budget, and what are we really looking for in this budget? Okay. Well, first let me tell you what's going on with this program. One, they plan to have 50 participants. They only have 30 because they're having their costs for the participant stipend and for the training supplies far exceeded, you know, what they had originally planned. So that's kind of our scenario here, you guys. So that's why I'm looking at this budget to see what I do at this point. Okay. There's my budget again. Okay. Well, now I'm going to look at percentage of my budget that's been spent. And a lot of you get this in your financial reports too. Well, I'm 50% through on time, but I've spent an overall 43.41% of my budget. Now, if I was on a full cash basis, I might say, well, that's right within the 7 to 8% variance. I'm spending right as planned. But not so. Not so. And if I look at it from an accrual standpoint or a modified accrual, oh, I've got a little money here that I may be able to move to training supplies and stipends. But you really need to take a closer look at it. Okay? And what you really need to do is look at your fixed costs. All right? So as you can see, I'm on a modified accrual. Just work with me on this, you guys. I'm on a modified accrual. So I actually do have some money in direct labor that I can move, and the fringe will follow with it. Travel, clearly I've taken the trips. Let's pretend I've taken the trips that I planned, so I've got an extra $1,000 here. Office supplies, we're going to have to talk about what we need to purchase here. All right? Training supplies, I know I'm spending a lot here. So, and boy, is that percentage ever off. I'm not spending as much as I should. I've got some left. Maybe I just thought I was spending extra for training supplies. And all the way down the line. That's what, and you're going to have to look at your fixed and your variables. Okay, and based on that, I think that I do have some money that I might be able to move, between the two projects. I think I have about, well, looking at this, I have about 9%. But before I can say that definitively, I'm going to have to look at what am I going to incur in costs for the next 6 months. All right? Maybe there's some costs that are going to come into play in the next 6 months, so I can't just go straight on that report. So then I have to go through my different line items, and I have to look, okay, this is easy. I can project out my labor and my fringe, no problem. My travel, I have no more trips planned. This is my best guess that I'm going to spend about $1,200 in office supplies and in training supplies at my current level of spending, all right? And same thing for postage and all the way down the line. So based on this, then I know that I potentially have $17,590 that I can maybe move between line items, all right, and make some kind of changes. So what I want to do is I want to serve 60 participants instead of my 50. I know I've got some money to put in the training supplies and stipends, but that's going to take, and it's taking more staff time. So I really want to do a modification that's going to add another part-time staff with that $17,000, double my training supplies, and double my participant stipends. That's what I want to do. And I can do it because I have the money to do it. So this is what I'm going to do. All right? This is my approved budget. This is where I want to make my changes. And this is my proposed budget. All right. Now looking at that, we have a couple of things that we need to take into place. Is this more than 25% of my total award? No, this is only about 9% that I want to move. So I'm cool there. I'm good there. Do I have any costs in here that would require that I get prior approval based on the cost principles? Well, if I'm a college or I'm a tribe, I look good there. However, if I'm a nonprofit, any movement of participant support costs requires a prior approval. So in that case, I am going to have to go to my program specialist and to my grant specialist about this. All right, and then follow that process. With A&As, there's a very specific process to follow for a budget modification. But that's where knowing the rules is so critical. You can say, this is what I need to do. I'm going to serve twice as many participants, really for a very small amount of dollars. It's well within the flexibility, and it's going to make my project have a greater impact in my community. All right? So that's really the part of going through a budget and knowing, what kind of changes do I need to make. Again, though, program and finance have to work together, all right? You talk to the program person, and I don't know a program director anywhere that doesn't have things that they want to do with that project once they get into it that maybe hadn't been thought of in planning that would fit well within the scope. And you look at, do we have the funds available? Does it fit within the scope of work? Will any of these require a formal budget modification? Will it require just an internal modification? And if so, how are we going to move the money? And then just do it. And it really doesn't take that much time. I mean, you can do that fairly easily within, a few hours sitting down with your finance person or finance sitting down with program and really working together. But look at the benefit to this project just by taking that time and realizing, that, yeah, we can really, okay, training supplies cost more. Okay, we're spending more on stipends, but, that's okay. We're going to make it better. We're going to be more effective. We're going to have more of an impact. That's really all there is to a modification, but it's just sitting down and taking the time on a periodic basis to do that. I do want to reinforce what Tim said. Even if it doesn't require a formal budget modification, you really want to let your program specialist and your grant specialist know what you're doing. It can give us all the reasons why that is, so that everybody's on the same page with it. that's really all there is to do, okay? I have a couple of things that I think is really important that are kind of key to this whole session that I really do believe in, although I don't know if I'd call it my mantra, Matt, but you're going to hear it out of my mouth pretty much all the time I talk about budgets. And one, the budget is just a real integral part of the project. And the budget is there to support the project. And project people need to know the budget. You know, finance people know it. And project people, you monitor your budget, all right? Monitor your budget, see what's going on. And I'm a finance person, so I can say, you know, so you can see what's going on with it. And then make the changes that make your project work or make your project more effective. Just what's appropriate, because you do have flexibility. Again, you have your rules, you have your fixed costs, you have your variable costs, and monitor, you know, and make appropriate changes. That's what I have to say about this. But you can tell I get excited about it because I think it's so helpful to the program when those changes are made. I know none of you have done this, but in some of my directors, they have all tried to stuff things into certain line items that may not have been the best place, and we should have just set up a new line item for it or something like that, but they're trying to do what I call a force. And it flows so much easier when the money and the project activities are moving together, the flow is great, and one's not holding up the other. And so that's what I have to say about modifying your budget. Okay, Matt, we want to go to questions?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Susan. Thank you for going through all those examples. Those are really good examples for, you know, how teams can work together to make some changes. So we're going to get into another Q&A session. We're a little over time right now, so we're going to limit it to maybe 3 questions. And we have one from Angela right now, and let me read that. I'm not sure if Tim is still on the line. Are you still there, Tim?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, perfect, because this might be a question for you. So Angela asks, thank you for talking about how the team works together for these changes. When are OMB circulars changing to CFARS, C-F-A-R-S?
Oh, 2 CFR Part 220, 225, and 230. You want that one, Tim, or you want me to take it?
You can take it, Susan.
Okay, they're already there. You can go into 2 CFR Part 230 for colleges, and you'll see OMB AA 21. You can go into 2 CFR Part 225 for governmentals, and you'll see OMB A87, and you can go into 2 CFR Part 230, and you'll see OMB A122.
Yeah, and for those of you who maybe didn't understand that, in the follow-up email to this webinar, I will be sending out a link to the HHS Grants Management Policy Sources webpage, which includes references to all of those OMB circulars, as well as the HHS Grants Policy Statement that Tim cited earlier. So you could check that out and explore that on your own time as well. And sorry about that echo, Angela. I think that was from my speakers.
Okay, and the important thing too, though, you guys, is that you really need to use those circulars when you have a question about the elements of cost or things, cost allocation. I mean, I refer to those circulars weekly, at least. And I probably know them pretty well, but you just need to go in and look at the detail.
Thank you for that, Susan. Do you have any more questions? If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Okay, we have one question from Annie. Annie, please go ahead and ask your question. All right, Annie asks, in our budget, we have enough funds to add another person to our program and to hire all staff as full-time. Do I still need to submit a budget modification, or do I just need to let the GM or GS know? Grant manager or grant specialist.
Well, I would suggest that that person have a conversation with their project officer and their grant specialist, and let those persons decide whether or not it needs to be a full request submitted, or whether or not for prior approval, whether or not it constitutes prior approval, and if it doesn't, if they can implement it under their own authority, then they would probably just make a notation and put it in the grant file. So I think a conversation should happen first between the three parties, the grantee, the project officer, and the grant specialist, and then a decision made from that conversation.
Does that answer your question, Annie? All right. Thanks. Thanks for that question. Let's see. We have time for one more question. If anyone has one more question, please feel free to ask it now. Going once, going twice. Okay, so I think those are all of our questions. So once again, I just want to thank both of our presenters today, Susan White and Tim Chappelle. That was, a lot of really good information that we can use on our budgets, especially in making budget modifications according to HHS and ANA policy. So thanks a lot for your participation. At this point, I'm going to be closing out the webinar. Just to review, today our two goals were to provide you with information on the rules that govern budget modifications of federally approved budgets, and to provide you with information on how to analyze the budget and modify the budget to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of your project. And I hope we were able to somewhat expand your knowledge in those areas. And just to kind of make you aware of these upcoming webinars once again, for those of you who logged in late, on May 22nd next week we have a webinar on urban communities and implementing native language classes. So if you are working with language programs, you probably want to check that out. On June 5th, the Pacific region will be leading a webinar on using social media in your nonprofit or native project. So don't miss that one either. And then on June 12th, we'll be having a webinar on Two-Spirit LGBT projects in Native communities. And you can register for those webinars on the events page of the ANA website. So thanks again for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Matt. I'm the Outreach and Technology Specialist for the Pacific Region TTA Center. If you have any questions, you can email me there. My email address is matt@kaʻānaniʻau.com, and you can call us on our office phone, which is also listed on the screen. After this webinar, I'll be sending an email out to everyone who registered. You look for that email in your inbox within the hour. Included in that will be some of the documents that Tim referenced during his part of the webinar, as well as a survey which you can use to tell us how we did and also to suggest topics for future webinars. And we really do look at the topics that you suggest. It helps us to tailor our weekly webinars to what you're looking for. So please take that opportunity, look out for that email, and thanks once again for joining us. Aloha.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.